I'm going to start with a statement which interests me about all these gardens that we've seen, which is that for the most part, perhaps not some of the ones that Judith showed us, but one of the stories that Sarah alluded to, but I've heard her go into in much greater detail when time allows, is that the Olmsteds were fired, weren't they? Because they were so determined not to do a formal garden. Because here's this hilly landscape, which we have here, a very steeply sloped site, very similar to the steeply sloped site at Untermeyer. And they said, this is counterintuitive to do all of this. You just saw what a remarkable earthwork and construction project is to make this happen. So one of the things that I think is interesting about these architectural gardens we're talking about today, and very similar to the way the fantastic garden at the Kummer by Shipman, these are gardens that are not about the natural condition. They're about doing something that is very self-consciously beautiful and lovely, but very artificial. And they're special sort of precincts in a way that are apart from the surroundings. And many of them include walls and sort of an architectural framework. But what I'm interested in all three of these gardens, because I, of course, have had the opportunity to speak to all our experts before and sort of pick their brains about what they were going to say today. What I'm interested in, because we are looking at a restoration of Blythewood, is I'd like to hear your thoughts about what to restore. Each of you have told me stories about the sort of moments that you have to decide what do we restore and what do we change. And all these gardens evolved to some degree. So I'm just going to open it up and ask you to dive in and talk about, as you were restoring gardens or thinking about where restorations were effective, how does that happen? What are the choices you make?
I would say that I look to sort of the shabby chic aesthetic of Italy, and where you see walls where stucco's falling off, and you just don't get so worried about it. You just sort of live with that. When we have a ruined building and you see gardens in England that build artificial follies and ruins, we have a real ruin, and we're just sort of dealing with that. So we're keeping certain layers intact. Well, people sort of have told me, don't polish it too much, that they love this evocative sort of ruined aspect about Untermeyer. So we're sort of very delicate at deciding how far to go and where to let it be ruined.
And also, I think you've all pointed out, I don't know how many gardeners the Jameses had at the time of the heyday of the garden. Do you know how many?
We think 30.
Yeah. So 30 gardens, 60 gardeners, 30 gardeners, 60 gardeners. You've talked about garden designs, Judith, where there was no possible way they could ever recreate that planting. So in many cases, the plantings also need to evolve, don't they?
I think the plantings are the most difficult part of the whole process. It's quote unquote easier to restore the architectural elements in a garden because it's something that's built, you can do it. But when it comes to the plants, there's been so many changes, and you look at the pictures and you think, how can I create that? And in one case of a Shipman garden, they did what I would call a plant by numbers. They got the plans, they got the plants, they got to put it in, but they didn't know how to maintain it. So that brings you to the next level is if you're going to maintain it, you have to plant, you have to use plants that gardeners today can take care of.
See, I have a question with the Blue Garden. I mean, I haven't been there, but it's big, but it's not vast. And you had this incredible benefactor who may have paid for the whole thing, so it's all wonderful. And did you ever, and I don't know how many gardeners you have and what kind of funding you have, but would you ever consider doing a literal, all the intricacies that was in part of the original, because you simplified it?
We had to simplify it. Mrs. Hamilton took one look at the 4 photographs of the interior beds and said, oh my, that looks like a lot of, and I always ask the people who come to visit, what? Work, maintenance. She said, I don't have a crew like that. I don't have a team who can maintain a garden. Maybe we won't plant the Blue Garden. So we had to go through a series of exercises reducing the Blue Garden to water, pots, and blue flowering vines on the trellises before we all came to an agreement that if we simplified the planting, that we could try to bring back the design
How many
intent.
gardeners do you have?
We have 1 3/4. And on Thursdays, a crew of 2 men come. So it's doable. Is that a lot or a little?
A little.
A little.
Yeah.
So, I mean, every decision that I make is to make their job simpler.
Yeah.
You have a story about a hydrangea, don't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. A good story about a hydrangea. And this I think shows about the evolution and how you have to be creative in your planting.
Should I tell?
Yeah, please. So yeah.
I heard, I don't have children, but I heard that children are very humbling. I think gardens are more humbling. This is year 4 of the Blue Garden, and we have learned so many lessons. It's really fun. I mean, it's just fabulous. But we have design soils. How many of you have heard about this thing about design soils? So they're used in larger projects so that the land doesn't compact, it drains, and the roots are very happy. So our soil scientist, great Tim Krall from Penn State, favors sand-based soils. Well, great, our sand-based soils, the sand was limestone. So we had bright pink hydrangeas, and nothing that we did to try to reduce.
Not good in the Blue Garden.
Not
right?
good in the Blue Garden. It was sweet as it could be rather than so acidic. And we had to dig out all of the soil around the hydrangeas. Now, it's not just color, it's the health of a plant. The pH has to be balanced. So we did all that, and then guess what? We found out that the water we were using was 8.8. 7 is neutral, 5.5 is what hydrangeas like. So we had to hire a firm that does agricultural, they provide huge systems for agriculture, including pH. So we had to add an acid injector into our tank. And guess what we use for the acid? Battery acid. Can you believe it? But anyway, so that's one of our lessons.
Steve, I think I didn't know the story until today of the ruin, the gatehouse ruin at the base. I mean, I think it's also interesting as we think about preservation of gardens as our organization and all of these gardens, and you all think about all the time. The decision to leave the graffiti is also a way of letting the garden evolve and also binding it to place. And I think it's probably important to people who explored and rambled through and may have actually been doing the graffiti when the garden was abandoned.
We were, one of the gardeners knew somebody who was a graffiti artist. So we operated for about a year under the assumption that we were going to paint over the graffiti on the inside with graffiti art. But, enough people had told me, Steve, they really like this ruined thing and don't clean it up too much. But inside the gatehouse, not only is there graffiti, but there's satanic graffiti. If you Google Untermeyer Gardens and satanic or David Berkowitz, who was a mass murderer, he lived there. I mean, he hung out there, but no one was murdered there. But I mean, there's a real, that's another layer of history, and we're keeping the satanic stuff there.
Well, I think. Well, I do think. I mean, as these gardens move from private to public realms, I think I'm certain that there are many people. Betsy's moved out of the room, but there are many people who have stories about their impressions and who they met, how they spent time in Blythewood. And obviously, it's a tremendously attractive environment. So I think that sort of moving forward slowly with these gardens and allowing them to evolve is important. I want to open up to questions from the audience if anyone has some questions. Yeah.
I think what we just talked about is fascinating. How you can integrate like modern kind of. Not necessarily satanistic, but kind of modern art and classical garden. So I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but
Do you add new art to Untermeyer ever?
We have not done any. I've had an idea. I was on the board at Wave Hill for 10 years, and there had been a period at Wave Hill where they tried to incorporate changing modern art into the garden, and it was very controversial. And the gardening staff and Marco was very opposed to, because it really damaged the garden in a significant way. So it has to be done very carefully and slowly. But in the Persian garden, we have the 4 rivers of paradise, and we have these 4 quadrants, each subdivided by 4. And I've had an idea, wouldn't it be great to get, say, 4 sculptures that were considered to be for, like, the 4 seasons or the 4 elements, and that you had 4 modern sculptures that sort of worked really well with the organization of the garden, not just sort of willy-nilly plunked down. That hasn't happened yet. I mean, but it's sort of in the back of my mind.
Any other questions from the? Yes, it's back there.
These old gardens had almost always water features, and I was just curious, historically, were they drained and the pipes dealt with every winter like we would have to do here, or how were they dealt with historically in the teens, 20s, and 30s?
And where was the water coming from? Where did the water come from in Untermeyer?
Untermeyer was all just, regular piped water that was pumped, and it wasn't coming from any natural spring.
It's like a city water.
I
basically.
think he drained them. They blew them out or whatever. But I mean, the mosaics, I think even in Untermeyer's day, I've seen historic photos from like the late 30s, and it looks like he was having real mosaic problems even then. Like ice, I could see ice at the bottom of the pool.
Sarah, are there wells now that provide the water for?
No, that's on my list. I'd love to.
Like your tiles, like what's going to happen to your tiles over the winter in time with buckling and all that?
They've been, the
So
blue
far.
tiles have been there since the 80s. But we drain the pools,
Right.
except for the concrete one.
It's just that
And it's
when the water gets
Yes.
between, even though it's drained, it can get underneath through the cracks. With mosaics, anyway.
Judith, do you know at the Kummer what they're doing? Because the Kummer was very badly damaged. The Shibben Garden was very badly damaged by Hurricane
Irma.
Irma, which took a very erratic path and did a lot of damage to Jacksonville. Do you know what they're trying to do to prevent that from happening in the future? Because there again,
I don't think they can prevent it. They've had so many storms in the south and in Jacksonville. The garden, has anybody been there?
Yes.
I know you've been there. It's right adjacent to the St. Johns River, and every time there's a storm, the water comes up. The garden has been flooded on many different occasions, hence losing all the azaleas and losing the cypresses, and then the garden volunteers come back and replant them again. But with Irma, it was just like Longview. The water came in and sat for 24 hours.
And it was brackish water too, so it's not only the invasion
brackish
of
water,
but it's the
from
salt in the
St.
left in
Johns
soil.
River
Yeah.
flooded the garden, and it was stagnant for 24 hours, and it killed just about everything in the garden.
That happened to the Battery at Lower Manhattan with Sandy too, and they had to remove the soil because it was wrecked from the
I think that's
salt.
what the Kummer is doing. They're fundraising, and thanks to a nice grant from the Garden Conservancy, they're now interviewing contractors to try to figure out what to do.
Steve, at Untermeyer, did you have original planting plans?
No, we almost, unlike you, almost have no architectural plans of anything.
Wow.
It's just almost all disappeared. We have photographs, but what I say is sort of the dirty secret about Untermeyer is that we don't really like the plantings that he did.
That's why I asked the question, because he told me that before, which I love.
As Marco Polo Stefano said, it was kind of like the Rockettes compared to ballet, and we'd rather be ballet.
So he didn't do the elephant ears and what you have there now?
What's the question?
Untermeyer did not do those.
He did not do elephant ears. No,
No, I wouldn't think so.
Yeah. And when we did marigolds that one year for the Indians, the Wall Street Journal got word of it, and they put it on the front page of like their weekend section, and they said, marigolds are like the lowest of the low plants. You put it, that's what you plant at gas stations. But
in Indian gardens, apparently.
But what Timothy did was he got all these incredible different types of marigolds, and it was spectacularly beautiful. And this goes back to Marco is saying that even the humblest plant can be very giving, and it's just not that it's humble, but it's how you use it.
Right.
That's exactly what Gertrude Jekyll said. There are no bad plants.
That's
there are
right.
only bad things that people do to plants.
Here's a question from the audience.
Steve, I didn't get your funding mechanism for your organization. What is? How are you funded? I know she's through a foundation.
We have zero endowment. We have no major benefactors, unfortunately. We've gotten almost no government funding, and we're the only, so far as we know, great garden in America that's open, free to the public. Free of charge. There's no admission. So it's just such an incredible garden with such an incredible history. And I didn't get into the history of who Sammy Untermeyer was, but if you get into that, it's very, very compelling. And so we have thousands of donors. We have no memberships. We have a one-room office it's maybe 3 times the size of this dais. And the whole Conservancy runs out of a one-room office. We have no gift shop. We have no cafeteria. We have nothing that we could offer. It's like a totally alternative sort of scenario. We have nothing that we can give to people to be members. We don't have a membership drive. We don't send baseball caps or tote bags or anything like that. We just have an annual appeal, and people are really into it. And we get, $5, but we get, bigger money. But I mean, I've probably raised, $4 million over 7 years. The first year budget was $100,000. Next year, $150,000. Next year, $250,000. The next year, $500,000. The next year, $1 million. And now it's like $1.3 million a year. So just through bits and pieces, we're getting it, but it's almost all private money.
It's all private money, but it's from people, yes, of course. But it's, the wonderful thing with these gardens is as they're restored, they begin to, and I know it's difficult for all of us to raise these funds, but the beauty of the gardens begins to sell themselves, and I think that people, as Leon said very eloquently, I think that people in an increasingly technological, disconnected world where we're always looking at screens, I think people, every so often someone says to me, wouldn't it be nice if we could have virtual reality garden tours? I was like, absolutely not.
So the end,
I don't want that.
the end of my lecture, there was a slide that probably didn't make sense to anybody, but we said garden for the world. And a Persian garden is, based on the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is a belief of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. All the Abrahamic religions believe in the Garden of Eden. So a lot of people in the world find a piece of themselves in that garden. And because it's free, I mean, you see every type of person going in that garden. And I think the first year, we have no idea really what the attendance is because there's no one monitoring. We have no visitor staff or anything like that. We have like a part-time person in development. So we think the first year maybe 5,000 people came, and we think last year 70,000 people came in a year. So
it's fantastic. So I want to encourage you all as we wrap up now to visit these gardens, visit the Blue Garden, visit Untermeyer Garden, and by all means also purchase Judith's fantastic book on Ellen Biddle Shipman. It's full of fantastic information and really important documentation. And I also want to say in closing that for the reason we are here is that the rehabilitation of Blythewood needs all of our support. So please make sure you're on the mailing list before you leave today. And so that we can update you with the Garden Conservancy and the Friends of Blythewood on our progress. Please join the Friends of Blythewood and help us preserve Blythewood Garden for future generations to enjoy. Thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers.